don't get it.
This is the Nintendo GameCube.
They weren't lying.
This is Nintendo's second worst selling console of all time, because it's hard to do worse than this.
Now, this is a strange fact to me, because go up and ask any Nintendo fan over the age of 18, and 9 times out of 10, they're gonna say the GameCube's their favorite console. And personally, I just don't get it.
Primarily announced on May 12, 1999 as Project Dolphin, this was meant to be the successor to the Nintendo 64. Now, successor or not, one of the big issues Nintendo was having at the time was their refusal to go to discs rather than cartridges. Everyone at the time was realizing that cartridges were a thing of the past, and it was time for Nintendo to move to the future and trash the cartridges. And eventually, we found out that they were going to trash the cartridges. But instead of doing what everyone else was doing, they did their own thing. Once again, this is not what we meant when we said move to disc. I can't even see these things. Okay, but Nintendo refusing to do the norm is a trend that hasn't stopped to this day. Anywho, eventually both the final name and design of the console got announced, and on August 25th, 2000, the world was introduced to the Nintendo GameCube.
Again, they were not lying. Anywho, in November of 2001 here in the United States, the Nintendo GameCube released. And one of the most important things of a console's launch is launch titles.
What did the GameCube do wrong in this situation? Did the GameCube A, forget to put its seatbelt on, B, forget to launch with a new 3D Mario, or C, all of the above? I'll give you a second. The answer is B. Why wear a seatbelt when there's no new 3D Mario? Because that's a world I don't care to live in. Okay, well, the big thing about the N64 was 3D graphics and gameplay, and Mario 64 revolutionized that. So when Nintendo drops a new console, the big thing on gamers' minds are, what could Mario do next to revolutionize the industry? But instead, we got Super Monkey Ball. Jokes aside, Super Monkey Ball on the GameCube was a big deal. This was one of the first times Sega released a game on Nintendo hardware. But back to the launch titles, we also got Wave Race Blue Storm. Now, I'm a huge fan of Wave Race 64, and to this day I still haven't played Blue Storm, so I can't really say much about the game. And as for Super Monkey Ball, I figure if I play one of them, I play all Super Monkey Ball games. They seem pretty similar to me, that's just me. And finally, that brings us to Luigi's Mansion. To the average fan in 2001, this was a major letdown. It took a couple of years to finally get the recognition it deserved because this game shows off exactly what the GameCube can do, and it does it really well. I think if this was released with a 3D Mario, it would have been looked at in a better light. But overall, this is a kinda sucky launch lineup. Sure, there were more games released in North America at launch, but from my personal decision, none of them are worth noting.
But in the grand scheme of things, launch titles really only matter at the beginning of the console's lifespan. But on that topic, how about we talk about something that matters the whole way through? The console design.
I, the GameCube, look like a lunchbox. So there's a lot to unpack here.
It's a cube. A GameCube. Again, they were not lying.
With 4 controller ports, a disc reader, 2 memory card slots, and a cube-shaped design, we have Nintendo's most perfect named console. Now, the cube-shaped design is fun, but this was during the era where Nintendo just wasn't as cool as the competition anymore. Like in the 80s, Nintendo was on top of the world. Then in the 90s, Sega gave them a run for their money for a short bit there, but then finally in the 2000s, Sony dropped a bomb on the gaming industry. So, this is the PlayStation 2, the current best-selling console of all time.
And if I'm gonna be completely honest, it makes perfect sense.
The PS2 wasn't just a gaming device. This was an entertainment system for the entire family, because not only did it play video games, but it also played DVDs. Now, Nintendo did tease that the GameCube might be able to play DVDs, but here in North America, that never became a reality. From the start of the GameCube's life, it had its word cut out for it. The PS2 had an amazing game library and it could play DVDs. What the GameCube needed to do is release some amazing games to counteract what the PS2 was capable of. Great, now show me the third-party support. Now, obviously there were third-party titles on the GameCube, but there just simply wasn't enough. And that all boils down to the stupid small discs. It made it so much harder to develop for the hardware because you couldn't fit enough information onto the baby discs. So instead, all the third-party developers moved on to the PS2, where it was easy to develop. Anywho, a year into the GameCube's lifespan, Nintendo released the game that everyone was waiting for. The next big 3D Mario.
Super Mario Sunshine! Woohoo!
Oh, come on! Okay, so in the grand scheme of things, Super Mario Sunshine isn't bad. In fact, it's quite good. But when you design a 3D Mario with the tightest controls Mario's ever had and slap a stupid water pack on his back, making the controls an afterthought, of course I'm gonna be mad! And while Super Mario Sunshine does have its charms, like the locations are great, the music's great, the overall story is great, the world building is great, the characters are great, it's just unfortunately the platforming gets sacrificed for exploration. And hey, that could be your thing, you could love that. And if you do, I'm happy for you. But as for me, I prefer the normal Mario experience, more focused on level design and platforming than world building and exploration. Super Mario Sunshine was met with mixed reactions, and while in most cases that's fine, they could get away with that. But with the GameCube, they needed a big pull to the console, and unfortunately, Mario Sunshine wasn't it. As for the rest of the GameCube library, there are a ton of great Nintendo games on here. But it brings up a problem. All of these games are first-party Nintendo games, and while there's sort of a little something here for everyone, this is really a console designed for Nintendo fans and Nintendo fans only. If you weren't huge on Nintendo, the GameCube does absolutely nothing to rope you in, and that's its biggest flaw. The PS2 had things for not only the whole family, but gamers as a whole. The GameCube really only caters to Nintendo fans.
If the GameCube only caters to Nintendo fans, then this should be really high on my list of favorite consoles. But it's not.
And there's actually a couple of reasons, but let's start with the big one. The controller. The GameCube controller is highly praised, and some consider it the best controller of all time. I disagree. I think the GameCube controller is an absolute mess. I mean, just look at this thing. What were they thinking with the button layout? A is so big there's no room for X and Y, and is it just me, or does anyone else constantly get X and Y and confused? And what's up with the stupid tiny C-stick? It just feels gross using this thing, it's too small. But speaking of small, if you're gonna trash the D-pad this much, why not just get rid of it in general? So on the GameCube, 2D games were really set aside so big 3D ones could steal the show. If you wanted 2D experience at the time, play the Game Boy Advance. But the problem with this is they trashed the D-pad, it's disgustingly small and I hate using it. And I mean, it's not all bad. The GameCube controller has full rumble support and features 2 hybrid analog triggers, which is a small detail that often goes overlooked, but it's nice when games incorporate it. Now, next up we have memory cards, and I get it, they're a necessary evil, but I just hate memory cards. After a while they start to stop working, and I feel like I'm constantly swapping cards for each game because there's never enough room on each one. It shouldn't be this hard to keep my save data, but again, I do understand why they're here. It's just, man, they're so inconvenient.
You know what? No, let's take a break from all this negativity and let's talk about some of the GameCube's gimmicks.
The Game Boy Advance launched around the same time as the GameCube, so Nintendo released a GBA to GameCube link cable, a way to plug your Game Boy Advance into your GameCube to use as a controller with its own screen. The only problem is these were sold separately and it's near impossible to experience a game that uses these because of the price point. To get the max amount of players in one of these games, you're going to need 4 GBAs, 4 cables, and a GameCube. That's a lot of money. Next up, I actually picked this up recently. We have the GameCube microphone, and if I'm correct, there's like 6 games you can use this on, 2 of which being Mario Party 6 and 7. I can only imagine it's used for the most basic of voice-controlled mini-games, but it's pretty neat that they have one. And finally, we have the Game Boy Player. It's an add-on to the bottom of your console that allows you to play Game Boy games on your TV. This would be so cool, except I never owned one of these, and unfortunately, they're really expensive right now. And to wrap things up, after looking back at it, I do see why the GameCube sold poorly. It was meant for one thing and one thing only: Die-hard Nintendo fans. The console saw plenty of great first-party titles, but at the time, DVD players were the big new thing. So why would you buy a console that can only play video games when you can get one that does both? But if you were a Nintendo fan, you were having the time of your life because the GameCube is home to many things, and while it may not be my favorite console, I definitely understand why it would be your favorite console.
Or at least I did understand a couple of years later certain versions of the Wii were able to play GameCube games, making this pretty much worthless.